Thank you, Joe. Great to be with you all to talk about a subject that we all have great interest in, Israel, and what God is doing today throughout the world. We are literally living in the most exciting time in biblical history, and I'm thankful that we do understand the biblical significance of what's happening today. First of all, before I get going on my presentation, watch.org is our website. We post news 365 days out of the year on world news that's biblically relevant, and that's our focus. Also, at the end of every week on Friday, I put out a news report that is by subscription. It's 14 to 15 pages of a weekly summary of what happened that week with insight from behind the scenes there at the White House, where I work as a White House correspondent. And it is getting very difficult to keep it within that many pages. We've been doing this for a long time, and there is so much that I have to kind of cut and summarize each week. There is so much happening so quickly. I'll go into a lot of detail about that tomorrow night, the things that are taking place. But every week there's things happening, and it's getting more and more difficult to connect the dots. The things that we used to watch are not behaving like they used to behave. Thank God we have the scriptures, which helps. And at the same time, things are happening so quick and the dots are bouncing off each other and they're moving in so many different directions, it's getting very challenging to stay up with it. But we have 5 people that help me do this. So we put it out. It goes out by email, and it's also in our online area. And we have a 6-month subscription that is $1.15 a week, and our annual subscription is $1 a week. So it's reasonable, and it's just the main way that we support our work and at the same time keep our brothers and sisters in Christ and a lot of Jewish readers up to date with what's going on that's relevant. And we put that out every Friday by 5 p.m. My book, Eye to Eye, that Joe mentioned, we have been able to share with many, many people across our country and around the world the biblical significance and the consequences of dividing the land of Israel. This book cover here that's Hurricane Isabel that was heading towards Washington, D.C. as President Bush was meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan. And the Star of David is where the eyes are focused, and we tie that into the title, Eye to Eye, the title that the Lord gave my wife out of Isaiah 52:8, that talks about the time when prophecy and news will see eye to eye. And our American presidents have had a very significant biblical role in what I'm going to share with you today. No nation in the world has had a greater involvement in Bible prophecy being fulfilled. We're not obviously in final day scriptures, but in terms of being the catalyst and the nation that is moving the world to the climax and the final day events, no country in the world is more involved than the United States of America. Our first chapter is on the historical basis for Israel's right to its land. We have maps of what Israel was supposed to have. We have the original Abrahamic covenant map that I'll share with you shortly. We also have the scriptures that talk about the land of Israel and its biblical importance. Chapter 2, I talk about the era of replacement theology, names, organizations, and statements. Today, 70% of the American church has no biblical understanding of the significance of what is taking place in the nation of Israel. Chapter 3 through 6 talks about the Bush, Clinton, and Bush, the record-setting catastrophes and events that took place as they were applying pressure on Israel to divide their covenant land. We had many record-setting catastrophes, and I have every one of them during Bush, Clinton, and Bush's time in office. Chapter 7 deals with the U.S. catastrophes and events. Especially 2005, when President Bush was working with Israel to force the Jews out of the 25 settlements in Gaza and the couple settlements in northern Samaria, and the other events that took place. Hurricanes Dennis, Katrina, Rita, and Wilma, all 4 of those billion-dollar-plus events had a direct connection to the nation of Israel. Chapter 8, Major U.S. Catastrophes and Events in Perspective from 1991 to the present. You'll be able to see the event and that would happen right next to each other. And it's extraordinary. These are events that you will all be familiar with because they're all record-setting. Chapter 9 through 11 is periods of disruption. When our President Bush, I specifically focus on President George W. Bush's time in office, when he was in office and his administration was applying pressure in Israel, things became very disruptive, very chaotic. He'd back off, things would calm. He'd push forward again, things would worsen. He'd have people dropping out of his administration. He was having to defend what they did after 9/11, political problems in Iraq. He'd back off, things would calm. And I documented, I think it's 12 or 13 events in the book. And it's just amazing to see. When you touch that land, things happen. Chapter 12, the terror events in Israel. When the leadership of Israel would say, yes, we are in favor of a Palestinian state, a major terror-related event would happen immediately. And that was because of U.S. pressure on them. I have 34 events documented. It was like as if the Lord lifted his restraining hand of protection for that moment when the Israeli leaders talked about giving up the covenant land and the corresponding event. Chapter 13, U.S. presidents and Middle East leaders involved in the peace process and the consequences. I'll go into that shortly. Every U.S. president, every Middle East leader, every Israeli prime minister that attempted to divide or go along with the dividing of the land of Israel, what price did they pay? Chapter 14, the strange parallels to Yitzhak Rabin and Ariel Sharon's political endings. Extremely interesting parallels, to say the least. And then chapter 15 was about Israel's new leader, Ehud Olmert, and recently he has been replaced by Benjamin Netanyahu. Well, when we look at all these events, we know some markers. We know some markers to watch in these times. We know that God has a special relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. So we really focus on that today when we put these news reports out, is that special relationship and that special bond and the special promises that the Lord has done and given to the Jewish people. Promised land, extremely important. This was land that God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. Promised land. Holy land. Like no other land in the world. No other land in the world is holy land. But the land that Israel occupies is only 24% of the original promise, which I'll show you shortly. But nonetheless, this is holy land, promised land. The city of Jerusalem is promised. It's holy. And anybody that attempts to divide it or divide the land of Israel will pay the price and have paid the price. The theological error today. We have church leaders in America calling for the White House and the State Department to apply more pressure on Israel to leave the occupied land. They're obsessed with this. Religious organizations are obsessed with the fact that Jews occupy this land. They call it occupied land. We prefer calling it disruptive or our disputed land, but even better, covenant land. As we have Christians being persecuted and killed throughout the world by Muslims and others for their faith. That's where the focus should be. On those problems, but we hardly ever hear anything about that as we lose brothers and sisters every single day to radical Muslims, and others around the world. The world and the church are on the same page. We have the UN and the EU and the Quartet on the same page as the majority of the American church. The peace process, P-I-E-C-E would be a better word for the peace process. Piece by piece given up. Southern Lebanon is given, Israel gives Southern Lebanon up. Hezbollah moves in with 50,000 rockets and missiles. Israel moves out of Gaza, and a lot of Gazans did not want to see Israel move, because they knew when they moved it would be chaotic. When Israel was there, it was relative peace. But since Israel left Gaza 5 years ago, there's been more weapons smuggled into Gaza than in the previous 30 years. That has not brought peace. And at the same time, Hamas and Fatah had a very bloody and horrific civil war themselves, amongst themselves. And then we had 6,000 and up to 8,000 rockets fired on neighboring cities to Gaza. And Israel finally said enough in the end of 2008 and 2009. And the White House biblical role. you will see. It's amazing just how much the White House has been involved in the peace process as the great superpower, and the one that Israel has a deep long-term relationship with. We have been put in a role, and also the fact that we've had long-term relationships in the Middle East. Unfortunately, most of our CFR Council on Foreign Relations influenced State Department has this concept of how the world should work, or how things should work in the Middle East, and they've been wrong day after day, year after year for over 40 years, and have brought the Middle East to the stage that it is today. The think tankers, if they'd have used the scriptures, they wouldn't have been making the error. But no, these are our scholars. Harvard, Yale, Columbia. This is how we should work the Middle East. It hasn't worked. Record-setting catastrophes and events. 90% of the billion-dollar events in the last 20 years have a corresponding connection to pressure on the nation of Israel. This is beyond a coincidence. The disruption brought Obama. The problem with Iraq. President Bush's desire to create a situation there where we would build a nation build. You can't nation build in the Middle East. You can't bring democracy to the Middle East. When Tony Blair and George W. Bush were talking about what Britain had done in Northern Ireland, comparing that to what they wanted to see done in the Middle East, was totally naive, for a kind word. It's totally unrealistic. We've spent $1 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq. According to a poll at the end of last year, the most corrupt nation in the world is Somalia, number 2 is Afghanistan, and number 4 is Iraq. And we've lost over 5,500 American soldiers' lives, 30,000 plus injured, and we've disrupted many people's lives because of these wars. Nation building is not the answer, but nonetheless, something had to be done. And what's interesting and ironic is the aggression in the Middle East, the active effort in the Middle East by George W. Bush's administration has done more to accelerate Bible prophecy than any other president. Also his statement, 2 states living side by side in peace and security, also has accelerated final day events, has become the mantra, for the lack of a better word, of today's peace process. And also, because of the war in Iraq, this was something Barack Obama stood on. This helped him get elected. Also, the enormous financial obligation, not only because of what happened in 9/11, but also the attempt to overstimulate our economy, which also led to the subprime disaster, which also led to the point of creating an economic powerhouse in China, which competes with U.S. oil interests, had raised the price of oil up into the mid-140 range, right around 140, 147, that helped break 2 of our automobile companies and transfer over $500 billion of U.S. funds to countries in the Middle East, and a few of them sponsor terrorism. We have misunderstood the Middle East for so long, and these errors have been an enormous cost to our country. And the errors of the time during the Bush administration, time in office. I like the Bush administration, I like the president, I like these people, but then again, they were following the think tankers at the CFR and the State Department on this concept of how they should bring law and order to the Middle East. And disruption helped Barack Obama get elected because they coined McCain as an extension, as a 3rd term of George W. Bush, and it was successful. But through all these mistakes and through all these errors, through our fiscal crisis here in America, through the greed of Wall Street, the casino gambling mentality, we are bringing one world financial order together. One world political order, as George W. Bush's father stated right before the war with Saddam Hussein, and right after Desert Storm in 91, was this is an example of one world order. This is a new world order. We hear about it. We see it in the scriptures. We've been hearing about it for many years, those that study Bible prophecy. But what's interesting about world order is this is an attempt to bring order out of a chaotic world. What makes it chaotic? Greed makes it chaotic. Radical Islam makes it chaotic. Secular humanism makes it chaotic. But isn't it interesting, as all these mistakes, all these political errors have helped create this time of disruption, all these financial errors and the subprime disaster, putting people in homes that they couldn't afford that we're all paying for, whether it's drop in value, or whether it's foreclosures, or whether having to increase stimulus plans and financial bailouts where we're all going to be responsible for it through our taxes. This is leading to these decisions made in Washington have led to one world order, one world political order, and then one world religious order. John Foster Dulles, back in the, I think it was the 30s and 40s, believed that we needed to have one world political order. He was a chief member of the CFR, and we need one world religious order. We have the United States and Britain on the political order side, but we also need a religious order, and the United States needs to be actively involved with that, and that's how the World Council of Churches was created. And I'll show you the importance and the role that the World Council has here shortly. So we had the one world political order, the one world religious order. We had the World Council of Churches, which represents over 322 or so churches today. And then the Vatican is part of that, and it's built on social justice. Social justice is treating the symptom of the root of sin. A large part of our church today is wrapped up in this social justice movement, serving man, but refusing to talk about the consequences of sin in our fallen world, which is leading to a religious order that's merging with a political order. Treating the symptom, it's like taking an aspirin for a headache rather than trying to get to the root of the cause of the headache. But a large part of that church, which is so inclusive, will not deal with the reality of that problem. But then again, this isn't a surprise because we have the scriptures, one world political order, one world religious order, one world financial order. As of last September, when we had the G20 come together in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to put some things together that would commit over about 95% of the world economies are represented by the top 20 nations of the world. Came together for the purpose of one world financial order. And then we have Israel, the Middle East, and Russia. Israel is God's time clock. Jerusalem is God's time clock. The Middle East is another indicator of the times we're living in. Russia is another key final day player. President George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice attempted to democratize former Soviet Union countries when he was in office. Vladimir Putin was not happy with this. He started getting much more involved in the Middle East again. Russia's been a big player in the Middle East for a long time, and Henry Kissinger had the plan when he was with Nixon that we got to keep an eye on the Russians. We need to keep them in the peace process, and they were the ones that came together with the United States to sponsor UN Resolution 338, which brought the Yom Kippur War to an end. Kissinger's plan, and he's still involved, and he still talks to Obama to this day, and he's still behind the scenes involved, says that Russia needs to be in the loop. We know Gog Magog, Ezekiel 38 and 39 talks about the significant role that Russia will play in the final days. But through Bush and Rice's plan to democratize these former Soviet Union countries, Putin gave weapons to Syria and anti-aircraft missile systems to Syria that, by the way, didn't work when Israel went in to take out that nuke facility. Really got Syria and Iran nervous. And also the fact that they are providing Iran technology and equipment to develop a nuclear power facility in a country that has an abundance of natural gas. They and Russia have a large percentage of the world's natural gas, as well as the United States that our Democrats won't allow us to touch. We have plenty of natural gas, but nonetheless, Iran has a tremendous amount of natural gas and oil, and they don't need nuclear energy. And they will play cat and mouse with the entire international community until they have finished and have their weapon. And then we have the new U.S. administration, and I'll talk in much more detail about them tomorrow, along with everything else that's taking place in the Middle East with the current event wrap-up here. But the new U.S. administration was given a plan by the Council on Foreign Relations and the Brookings Institute right after they took office. It's in a book. You can go to the CFR.org website, and this is a plan for the new president. This is a plan for the new president on how he should handle the Middle East events. How to handle Syria, how to handle Iran, how to handle Lebanon, how to handle Iraq, and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Israel. And they're following it to a T. But we know all of these things are going to happen because Jesus is returning, and he's going to return to Jerusalem to begin his 1,000-year millennial reign. But we know in the scriptures, Genesis 12, 1 through 2 says, "Now the Lord has said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing." This was God's instruction to Abraham, to come to the land of Canaan. This was the beginning, almost 4,000 years ago. "And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curses thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." Those that have blessed Israel and the Jewish people have been blessed. And those that have opposed the Jewish people throughout history and the nation of Israel recently have been cursed. And there are consequences to interfering with God's plan for the nation of Israel and interfering with those that God called to move back to the land of Israel and to occupy it. The Jews are the ones that are to occupy that land. Not radical Muslims that speak peace in English and death to Israel in Arabic are involved in this peace process. No. This is God's covenant land. It's not designed or created for Arabs. It's 0.5% of the entire Middle East. But the problem is the Jews occupy it. And they just want to be left there in peace and security. "And he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of the Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it." Genesis 15:8. "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt and unto the great river, the river Euphrates." Here's the covenant land. Today Israel's on approximately only 25% of that land. The Euphrates River, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, parts of Lebanon, Israel, and parts of Egypt. That's the covenant land, and more than likely it won't be occupied fully until Christ returns. Some prophecy scholars believe that it might happen sooner. He might even occupy it prior to his return, but in many ways it'll probably be after his return. But I don't have a final answer on that. But nonetheless, it's the covenant land, and God said that he will establish his covenant between me and thee and thy seed after thee and their generations for an everlasting covenant. This covenant is still in place. "To be a God unto thee and to thy seed after thee." Members of the Replacement Theology Church believe that this covenant's not in place because of Israel's obstinance, and we've received this from a couple national Christian leaders who I deeply respect, but they don't believe that the covenant's still in place. But this is an everlasting covenant. It says that over and over again. And all of God's covenants are everlasting. The Mosaic covenant was replaced by the new covenant, but every other covenant is still in place. These covenants are still there. "And I will give unto thee and to thy seed after thee the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." But see what happened we began some theological error. In the 3rd centuries, theologians taught that the Bible's prophetic scriptures were allegorical and not literal. That's approximately 40% of our Bible. In other words, these are stories. They're not literal. They're allegorical. They're not relevant. And unfortunately, they taught that the church was the new Israel. Replacement. In other words, the church replaced Israel. This doctrinal error influenced King Constantine, Augustine, Martin Luther, John Wesley, John Calvin, and many other theologians over the century. Men of great faith. Many people came to Christ through these men, especially Wesley, Calvin, and Luther. Many. But nonetheless, they missed the part of Bible prophecies that speaks to the relevance of the nation of Israel. And unfortunately, this error led to 18 centuries of Jewish persecution, anti-Semitism, and the deaths of millions of Jews under the name of Christianity. My wife and I have friends that work for Jews for Jesus. And they say it's difficult to talk to Jews about Jesus sometimes because of the bad experiences that Jews have had under the cross, under the Protestant churches of Europe that stood by as 6 million Jews were slaughtered in the Holocaust. It's very difficult. Today, 100 million American church attendees have no understanding of Bible prophecy and the biblical significance of the nation of Israel. That's amazing. But that's the replacement theology part of the church. Huge part. It's about 67, just under 70% of the church today. But see, this error led to the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, the Spanish Inquisition of the 15th century, and the Holocaust of the 20th century. These church organizations are calling on Israel to leave Judea, Samaria, the Golan, and Jerusalem, which would put her into indefensible borders. Do we hear any outcry of the fact that putting Hamas-led Palestinians in East Jerusalem could affect the status in the city of Jerusalem, whether it's chemical weapons or atomic or any other kind of a weapon of mass destruction? Do we hear any concern from the replacement theology part of the church about this? None. It doesn't exist. Do we hear anything about the fact that Hezbollah has 50,000 rockets right now on Israel's northern border? Or the fact that Hamas is ending up with weapons the American taxpayers gave Fatah, that Fatah lost to Hamas in their civil war? Or the fact that Hamas will not acknowledge Israel's right to exist, and the fact that Hamas has 74 of 132 seats in the Palestinian parliament? No, we don't hear about that, but we do hear these world religious leaders standing on the side of Ban Ki-moon of the UN and the Middle Eastern leaders and other world leaders and the leaders of the EU, along with them calling on Israel to leave this occupied land. See, this 18 centuries of ignorance, this 18 centuries of blindness, this 18 centuries of not knowing the biblical significance of the nation of Israel, and that God will use them at the center of His redemptive plan for the nations of the world and many people within their churches. That they might be convinced, but they are not converted. They have stood with the international community, which has endangered Israel. And this whole peace process has done nothing to bring peace, and it's put Israel at its most dangerous and precarious time in its history. They also don't talk about the fact that the day after Israel became a state, May 14, 1948, the next day 5 Arab nations attacked them. And the Arab nations that attacked them told the Arabs of Palestine to leave, and after they destroyed the Jews of Palestine, they could come back. Well, the Jews of Palestine won. And that created the Arab of Palestine situation. And they gained the name the Palestinians sometime in the 60s or early 70s. That's the Palestinians. And also the fact that right after, anybody that read the newspaper in 67 or watched TV or listened to the radio knew it was just a matter of time before Israel's neighbors were going to attack them. Thanks to Assad of Syria and Nasser of Egypt's proclamation to the world that they were about to destroy the Zionist entity of Israel, Israel started getting ready. And boy, they got ready. King Hussein from Jordan said the Israelis knew more about the 34 Arab military facilities in the Middle East than they did. Israel also knew the Egyptian pilots were not in their planes at 7 o'clock in the morning, so that's a good time to go in and take out their entire Egyptian Air Force. And that's what they did. And 6 days later, they were humiliated. Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan. Right after that war, Israel offered to give all that land back if these Arabs would acknowledge their right to exist and allow them to live in peace and security. They said no, unanimously. And then a few months later, November 22nd, 1967, they went to the UN, and the UN passed Resolution 238 that called, or 242, 338 is the Yom Kippur one, 242 that called on Israel to give up this land. The Arabs had to use the international community to force them. And that's the backbone of today's Middle East peace process. That's the backbone of the Quartet Roadmap, 242 and 338. The church organizations of the Vatican, the World Council churches, and the National Council churches who have letter-writing campaigns to our White House asking them to put more pressure on Israel. But the White House has had a very extensive biblical role throughout this. I'll go through this fairly quickly. American presidents, Israeli prime ministers, Middle East leaders have all suffered the consequences of attempting to conquer or divide the land of Israel. This is what has happened to the Middle East leaders that have attempted to divide the land of Israel. A lot of tragic deaths there. Heart attack, Nasser, after the unsuccessful 6-day war defeat. Heart attack at 55. Sadat, assassinated at 63, right after the Camp David Accords. King Hussein from Jordan died of limb cancer at 64. Hafiz Assad of Syria had a heart attack at 69. As he is talking about this offer Ehud Barak had given him on a phone call to the Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. Yasser Arafat, according to David Frum, speechwriter from George W. Bush, and John Loftus, who wrote The Secret War Against the Jews, died of AIDS. Hariri was having late-night phone calls with the head of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, trying to coexist. You can have southern Lebanon, southern Beirut. We've got our area. Let's work together. Let's coexist. Hariri was assassinated. People believe it was Syria. Don't know for sure. Some people think it was Hezbollah. But sadly, Hariri's son, the new prime minister of Lebanon, went over and spent 2 days a couple months ago meeting with Assad to discuss coming together, working together, and a common enemy, Israel. Saddam Hussein died, hung, just like Haman. Saddam Hussein was developing the Jerusalem army. He was going to come in and capture Jerusalem. It never happened. And now we wait for the fate of Ahmadinejad of Iran and Nasrallah of Hezbollah. Based on this, it doesn't look too promising for them. Then the Israeli prime ministers. 12 years of seclusion after Camp David. Yitzhak Shamir government failed after the Bush's father put a lot of pressure on him. He kind of reluctantly went forward and his government failed. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Shimon Peres lost election. Benjamin Netanyahu, government fails 8 weeks after extraordinary pressure at the Y plantation. He finally agreed to give up 13% of Judea. 8 weeks later, government fails. Ehud Barak, after his very generous offer to Arafat at Camp David in 2000, his government failed. 12 weeks later, defeated by Ariel Sharon, who in the polls in late 2000 had 12 to 13% in the polls, and about 90 days later, he was the new prime minister of Israel. God has his hand on all things. Ariel Sharon had a massive stroke. To this day, he's still on life support system in Israel. And Ehud Olmert's legal troubles and indictments caused him to step down. Our American presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signed a letter with the King of Saudi Arabia stating specifically that if Israel wanted to become a state, he would contact the king automatically. He put this in writing 7 days later. He died in office, replaced by Harry Truman, who made sure Israel became a nation. John F. Kennedy did not want to see Israel go nuclear. They put a tremendous amount of pressure on David Ben-Gurion, the Israeli prime minister. He didn't want to see it happen. He was worried about another nuclear power. He finally decided to back off the pressure. Ben-Gurion stepped down, replaced by Levi Eshkol, because Kennedy wanted the Jewish vote in the election, said, okay, we want oversight. Tragically, John Kennedy was assassinated, replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who armed Israel, who was a friend of Israel, who supported Israel in the Six-Day War. And also, some people believe the best friend Israel's ever had in the office. Richard Nixon, peace efforts were stopped by Watergate. Gerald Ford was involved in an election, but he was trying to put a lot of pressure on Israel. During his short time in office, he lost his poorly run campaign. Jimmy Carter became president. Carter found Sadat in Begin. Sadat said, hey, we can't beat the Jews by military. Let's go to the peace table. They cut a peace deal, and after Carter's Camp David Accord, the highest gas prices in history, proportionate at that time, highest interest rates in history, Iran hostage crisis. It was a failed presidency in many ways. The Democratic Party for over 20 years didn't even acknowledge that Carter was one of them. They just moved him aside. Ronald Reagan, a friend of Israel who loved prophecy, who used to talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39 in White House offices, and his staff would say, oh, that's great, Ronald. Anyhow, let's talk about this national economy. Let's talk about this. He was fascinated with Ezekiel. And God used Ronald Reagan to bring down the Iron Curtain so the Jews could get out of Russia and so the gospel could be shared throughout Russia. God uses our presidents for his purpose, and that was a powerful way. But unfortunately, some people, Arafat, Perez, and Schultz, talked him into moving forward into the peace process. The Iran-Contra scandal broke, and that stopped his peace efforts. George Bush became president. He had a problem, Saddam Hussein. He brought the international community together in a war against Saddam. And he said to them, I will sponsor a Land for Peace conference when we are successful with Saddam. On October 30th of 1991, the Madrid Land for Peace conference began. This was the beginning of the peace process. As President Bush is in Madrid, Spain, talking about dividing the land of Israel, about Israel giving up this land, and a promise of peace and security for them, a major northeast storm was sending 30-foot waves into his home in Kennebunkport, Maine. This storm was not a normal storm. It created the highest waves in Atlantic Ocean history, 100-foot waves. It was 1 mile per hour under a hurricane. Some people say to this day in science and meteorologists said it was a hurricane, but it was right at that cusp. In cold water, and rather than going from west to east, it went east from west and was sending massive waves into his home in Maine. It was called the perfect storm. Movies, books, many people are aware of that. We did a special in the 700 Club showing President Bush at Madrid, and immediately thereafter he flew to Maine for he and Barbara to survey the damage of just under $1 million worth of damage happened to his home at the same time. Not a week or a month or a year later. At the time he's in a pulpit calling on Israel to give up the land. And Bill Clinton, his scandals broke at the time he was pressuring Israel the most. Benjamin Netanyahu was in the White House the night Lewinsky matter broke. Benjamin Netanyahu was being pressured by Clinton and Gore and Albright when the Chinese espionage scandal broke. Front page of newspapers in the United States and Europe, Clinton Chinese scandal, pressure Clinton on Netanyahu to cooperate. And Netanyahu had a meeting with Gore in London and also with Albright. George W. Bush's war on terror began right at the time he was negotiating with the king, Crown Prince Abdullah, who's now King Abdullah, for 17 days prior to 9/11. President Bush was negotiating with Crown Prince Abdullah on what was going to be the most comprehensive address ever given by an American president to the UN. They finished their work according to Crown Prince, who was their ambassador to the U.S. The work was done, Prince Bandar. The work was completed. He said he was taking 9/11 off. I have the Washington Post article in my book that documents everything that happened. They took 9/11 off, and then we had the horrific terror events of 9/11. They had finished a plan that was going to divide Jerusalem. They were going to announce to the world community that that President Bush favored a Palestinian state, a place his father or Clinton would never have dared gone. He was going to tell the world that this was his plan. Two democratic states living side by side in peace and security, and 9/11 stopped that from happening. The God of Israel did not produce the evil of 9/11, but our homeland security is the God of Israel. We had many events prior to 9/11 and many events since 9/11 stopped miraculously by our Lord. But Israel's problem with terror had now become ours and the world and everyone in this room and everybody that travels in the world, and many people throughout the world have been influenced and affected by what happened on 9/11. The same problems Israel faces, now the world was facing. And this has been a significant issue. I remember hearing an Israeli intelligence official speak in '98 in Texas, and he talked about the day that Islam was going to come to America, and I couldn't comprehend it in my mind. I couldn't comprehend it. Not America, not here. You know, we've been free. We have freedom. We have so much security. I couldn't comprehend it. Even though I'd been doing what I've been doing now for 4 years, I couldn't comprehend it. Even a couple months before 9/11, he says it's getting close. And it did happen. So all of our lives have been impacted by this. But during this time, Bush, Clinton, and Bush were in office. We've had 72 major catastrophes and our political crisis from October '91 to December 2008. Now I'm in the process of documenting it now with the new administration, the Obama administration. But nonetheless, we're talking about now the 14 costliest insurance events in U.S. history, the 10 costliest insurance events in U.S. history, 3 of the 4 largest tornado outbreaks in U.S. history, and the 2 largest terrorism events in U.S. history, the first and second World Trade Center events, were directly involved at the same day or within 24 hours of U.S. pressure on Israel. What was interesting in my study and research on this, the greater the pressure on Israel, the greater the corresponding catastrophe. We're talking about Hurricane Andrews. We're talking about the Northridge earthquake. We're talking about World Trade Center 1 and 2. We're talking about Katrina, Rita, Wilma, and others. And those 4 major hurricanes in 2004, all happening at the very same time. And the more the pressure, the greater the intensity of the events. We saw Hurricane Jean. I told my wife this was 9/27/2004. President Bush is in a heated election. He's going to the UN at 11 a.m. I think it's 9:21, I'm sorry, 9:21. 11 a.m. He gives this big address and he says that Israel must freeze settlement construction. Israel must leave unauthorized settlements. Israel must negotiate in good faith. And he talked about the future of Jerusalem, and he also said the Palestinians must do what they need. They must be serious too about the process. But this really was more of a message directed at Israel. Hurricane Jean had been traveling around for a while, was dissipating in the Atlantic, moving away from the United States. And as soon as Bush spoke, that storm regained its strength, started going east, started going southeast, started going southwest, and then went west and came right back to Florida. It's one of the most costly, intense hurricanes in U.S. history. And I have all the meteorologists' reports corresponding with what Bush said about the land of Israel. But I'll end with this one. Many people throughout the world, in August of 2005, were praying, and even throughout the early part of 2005, they were praying that God would stop the evacuation of 9,500 Israelis from Gaza and Samaria. Jews and Christians throughout the world, please, Lord, stop this, stop this. Don't force people from their homes. My wife and I were there July 4th weekend. We took a tour of Gush Katif, where there was a 21, 24 settlements in that area of southern Gaza. And we couldn't imagine that in a couple weeks that these buildings we were in, the synagogues, the homes, the office buildings, the retail stores would be leveled. It was hard for us to comprehend that, and it bothered me all the way back to Jerusalem in our armored bus. I couldn't think, you don't do this to anybody. You don't force anybody out of their home, especially for this false peace. And a lot of the Gazans wanted the Israelis to stay. But Sharon wanted to move his soldiers to other parts of Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu at that time says, when we get out of Gaza, we'll start having rockets being fired down on our cities. And boy, was that prophetic. But nonetheless, the Lord showed me also on that ride back from Gush Katif that this is going to happen, but there's still going to be consequences. It's going to happen because these are fulfillments of Bible prophecy. These things must happen prior to Christ's return. So, the evictions were completed. Authorities used force at times on Tuesday. This was a 7-day process. August 23rd to clear the 2 remaining West Bank settlements. Today we accomplished the first phase of the disengagement process related to the evacuation of the civilians, said Israeli Defense Force Chief Dan Halutz. Israeli forces plan to remove the settlers' belongings, destroy their houses, and then withdraw from Gaza. Destroy their houses. Shortly thereafter, President Bush applauded Sharon, saying, I want to congratulate Prime Minister Sharon for having made a very tough decision. As I've said in my remarks yesterday in Salt Lake City, the Prime Minister made a courageous decision to withdraw from the Gaza. This is a very hopeful period. Again, he applauded Prime Minister Sharon for making a decision that has really changed the dynamics on the ground and has really provided hope for the Palestinian people. My vision, my hope is that one day we'll see 2 states, 2 democratic states living side by side in peace and security. I might add that I had written President Bush 3 previous times, beginning in the summer of 2001, prior to 9/11, and advising him that there are consequences, provided a book that I had written at that time, co-written, and we had provided a book, we'd provided writing, we provided information saying that there would be consequences to dividing this land. I'd received a couple letters back from him, and I just completed eye to eye, and we've been waiting for the right time to present the book to President Bush, and we eventually revised the book. But we were waiting for the perfect time, so it was getting soon, it was getting close, because what was about to happen, within a couple hours of President Bush saying this, he said, just with a couple hours, Tropical Depression 12 formed near the Bahamas late that afternoon. The newly formed depression upgraded to Tropical Storm Katrina on the next day. Tropical Storm Katrina became Hurricane Katrina on Thursday the 25th. Hurricane Katrina came on shore in southeast Florida on August 26th. Hurricane Katrina became a fierce and enormous Category 4 hurricane pummeling Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama on August 29, devastating the city of New Orleans. The largest disaster in U.S. history and affecting an area the size of Britain. The largest event we'd ever had before that was 9/11, a $25 to $30 billion event. Then it was Hurricane Andrew, which was about 20 to 25 billion. And then Northridge earthquake, which is about 19, 20 billion. Katrina was 200 billion. The United States government in the first 10 days put out $116 billion for Katrina. Insured losses at 45 billion, uninsured losses in that same range. 200 billion. 34 straight days in Washington, D.C., the front page of our newspapers, 3 of them, the Washington Post, the Washington Times, and the Baltimore Sun, the news was Katrina. People around the world could not imagine that this happened in America. America's the one that is always helping when these things happen. The parallels that happen in Gaza that happen in the United States were alarmingly similar. Evacuees being forced out of Gaza, evacuees being forced out of New Orleans, evacuees being spread throughout Israel, evacuees being put in 34 U.S. states. 2,400 buildings destroyed in Gaza, 227,000 in the southern Gulf Coast. People living, evacuees living in tents and hotels, campgrounds, motorhomes in Israel. Same thing here, or I should say trailers. We've never had anything like this. And a lady at the White House said there were two things that disrupted the Bush administration. She'd been at the White House 25 years. She said 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina completely disrupted this administration's political plans. And you look at what happened right before 9/11 and look at what happened right before Katrina. You know, these events are hard to explain. The good news in many of these cases is many people come to Christ that have been affected in these areas. Pastor Jack was sharing that with what they're doing in Haiti right now, how many Haitians are coming to Christ right now in enormous numbers. And it's hard to understand this or explain this, but there is an atmospheric and a political consequence when the leaders of the world attempt to divide the Holy Land of Israel. Nonetheless, all these events are bringing things to completion. And we're watching as the heir, President Bush's desire to democratize the Middle East did not. Sent it in the wrong direction. His aggressive movement into the Middle East was a great recruiting vehicle for bin Laden and other Muslim groups, radical groups. His attempt to democratize former Soviet Union countries accelerated Russia's involvement in the Middle East. And today, Russia is developing a port in Tartus, Syria, in the Mediterranean, and another one planned for Libya and Yemen. And also, their relationship with Saudi Arabia is very solid and strong. Also, their relationship with Iran and Syria. And they also enjoy seeing us have our challenges in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But nonetheless, all these world leaders, all of our world leaders, including our leader today, God is using them. He's got a plan. But also to be encouraged, God has His people everywhere. Even the new chaplain at Camp David, where the presidents spend a lot of weekends, is a very strong Southern Baptist named Carrie Cash, whose great uncle was Johnny Cash. And this young man went to Southwestern Seminary, and he loves the Lord, and he is the chaplain at Camp David. And according to the Washington Post, Obama likes him. He really likes his message, and he's this big guy who almost played pro football, but due to an aneurysm, ended up going to seminary. Now he's got him at Camp David. So the good news is God is in control of all this. These are challenging and difficult times, but we know who wins, and it's us. And we also know the full book, Genesis to Revelation, is the Word of God, and it's going to play out exactly as written, and very likely in our time. Claudia, would you pray for us, please? So we got to keep praying for our leadership. This has been a difficult week. I'll go into some more details tomorrow. But again, God is in control. Thank you.